Good afternoon, dear students, and welcome to the EduSite Live lecture for the Social Science stream. Today we have with us Dr. Satish Kumar Jha, who is a professor of political science at the Aryabhatta College of University of Delhi. He has been talking about the political comparative studies, and today he will talk about how culture is emphasized as a way of studying the different political thoughts in a country. So over to Dr. Satish Kumar Jha.
Thank you, Unnati, and good afternoon. Today's lecture we are going to devote on political culture, particularly from the point of view of comparative politics in political science. As it is well known that political culture as a branch of study or as an area of study in comparative politics flourished in 50s and 60s, particularly due to the behavioral revolution which had preceded it in social sciences, including political science, and therefore, number of new tools and methods were devised by political scientists to study different political systems. And it was in this context that political culture as a subject also basically emerged. Now, this entire focus on political culture was basically meant to provide a more systematic understanding of politics, particularly in light of the expansion of global community, particularly due to the decolonization, and also coexistence of different types of ideological systems together. For example, Soviet Union, China, and many East European countries basically professing and practicing socialism basically coexisted along with the Western liberal democracies. So therefore, in the entire world was characterized by diversity of political situation, political systems, and therefore some of the political scientists who were influenced by this behavioral revolution and were trying to operationalize and use the categories which they had drawn from social anthropology and sociology, particularly from Weber, Parsons, and others. Like structural functionalism was basically offshoot of such mood, such intellectual climate. They were trying to look at the working and functioning of different political systems, and while doing so, they thought that study of political culture would be a very important tool to see that how a stable democracy emerges, or how the instability sets in. How Western liberal democracies are more stable compared to other democracies, particularly in third world countries, where many countries democracies rose and also fell with the same speed. And at the same time, this would also provide them some understanding that how the socialist systems in Soviet Union, East European countries, China, and other parts of the world, how they were functioning, how people's attitudes, orientation towards politics and their authority system could be studied and analysis. So therefore, culture in political science, when it was being discussed, it was basically meant to deal with the habits, behavior, and the outlook within or among the groups, and therefore this study of course was meant to have a comparative perspective, that how it can be compared between groups, how it can be compared among nations, between nations, and how it can be compared among different societies and different generations. So this is how this political culture as an approach, one can say, emerged in comparative politics in 50s and 60s, associated with the name of Almond and Bauer, particularly in terms of the civic culture, which they constructed as an ideal type and tried to basically fit in the different political systems which they studied, and they studied 5 nations, and they studied 5 different types of systems: UK, United States of America, Italy, Germany, and Mexico. And they constructed an ideal type, the ideal type that the best sample or best example of a stable liberal democracy, and how that was made possible. And it is in this context that they basically gave typology of culture. For example, subject political culture, parochial political culture, subject political culture, and participant political culture. And on basis of these three tripartite classification of political culture, they also constructed an ideal type, and that ideal type in their opinion was the civic culture, which was a combination of both subject and the participant culture. Therefore, neither purely participant nor purely subject, but a combination of two. How that is basically explained, how he arrived at this conclusion, what he did through this categorization, classification, and typologization, that perhaps we will be looking at in course of our discussion, which will be spread in two different sessions, two lectures, particularly on this issue, political culture. Now, one thing is very significant here to remember, that political culture in fact has been an area of study in sociology and anthropology from the very beginning, and therefore it is not new for other social sciences, as perhaps it is maybe new for for political science, because for political science this was not the case earlier. In fact, political culture was not given that much importance. Of course, one thing we should remember, that when we discuss political culture in fact is divided. The discussion on political culture is also divided along ideological line. Marxism and liberal tradition, they have different approach to look at political culture. We will also be discussing this Marxist approach or Marxist perspective on culture as a whole, and of course that includes political culture. Of course, they never use the term political culture the way Allman and Weber used, but nonetheless they talked about culture as part of their larger theoretical construct about history and society. But within liberal tradition, after this seminal work produced by Allman and Weber, we find particularly this work was produced in 1963, though Allman in 1956 had already started talking about culture as part of his structural functional discourse. But after 1963, even within liberal tradition, we find that a lot of interesting studies have been done over the years, and those studies have increased our understanding of this entire issue associated with political culture, which is basically people's orientation, or one can say that aggregate individual orientation, because aggregation of individual orientation, this was perhaps the purpose of this entire behavioral study of culture. So therefore, over the years this interest has increased manifold, and today we find that not only in fact within the liberal tradition itself, there are a number of new perspectives. Some of them have emerged as a reaction to Allman and Weber. Some of them have independently tried to study the attitude of people towards politics, attitude of people towards political system, attitude of people toward the larger social issues and social goals. So it is in this context that one should remember the contribution of Putnam and his social capital theory. One can also mention here this entire post-materialist discourse, particularly the way it has happened in the West in last few years. That is also suggestive of the similar focus on political culture, particularly associated with the name of Englehart, who 1971 came out with a very interesting work on this post-materialism, that how culture is not static, it keeps changing. If the earlier generations in the West were materialist, the later generations were post-materialists. Their concerns were different, their orientation was different, their attitude was different. So therefore, they have tried to basically point out the limitations of Allman and Powell's formulation of political culture, which thought that cultures remain same across time and space, and therefore some of the countries where they discovered that a very stable liberal democracy was functioning had that type of orientation of people across ages, over ages, across generations, and therefore they were static, not changing. But subsequent scholars have pointed out that that is not the case. Culture keeps changing, and therefore with the changes in the culture, we find the changes in the orientation and attitudes of the people, the belief system, the value system. the entire system of preferences, goals, etc., which all of them together basically define a culture. In fact, when it comes to what is political culture, of course, political culture is normally associated with attitudes and orientation of people towards politics, that is cultural and social mores of the people. Of course, when we say culture, culture of course implies codes of human behavior. In fact, at least human culture is codes of human behavior, and as we all know that these codes evolve over a long period of time in history, and therefore those evolutionary trajectories of people or human history, human beings, in fact is perhaps the main important component of this human culture. Of course, the culture includes both material and social culture. Of course, the way social culture evolves over ages, similarly the material culture also evolves the ages. This is how historians study the evolution of material culture. This is how historians study, and the social anthropologists study the evolution of social culture. Now, political culture, when we say political culture, of course, those codes are important, but nonetheless here the focus shifts, and the focus comes on attitudes and orientation of people towards politics, because what happened, that how people are reacting, how people are looking at politics, how people are having a particular type of belief system, particularly in terms of their political orientation. What is their ideological commitment? What are their political choices and preferences? All of them basically are discussed in name of within this broad discussion of political culture. Of course, one thing we should remember that before we go for a more detailed discussion of Almond and Barber's writing 1963, the civic culture, which of course, as I mentioned, was a combination of both subject and the participant culture, the ideal type construction. In ideal type, which he tried to construct in pure Weberian fashion, because I mentioned in the very beginning that Weber and Parsons, these were the two, in fact, very important influences on the whole host of approaches and scholarship which emerged particularly in aftermath of behavioral revolution in political science, particularly structuralism, structural functionalism, system theory, and so on and so forth. So therefore, in fact, the purpose of this entire behavioral revolution was to provide an aggregate individual orientations, data of aggregate individual orientations towards various political systems. And it is in this context I mentioned that the 5 nations were selected and studied by Almond and Barber: United Kingdom, United States of America, Germany, Italy, and Mexico. Germany, of course, west before unification, because only west part of Germany was considered as liberal democracy. So therefore, this comparative study of culture of these 5 nations, through this comparative study of 5 nations, Almond and Barber try to construct an ideal type, that how liberal democracy can survive, how liberal democracy can become stable, and why those countries which have gone for liberal democracy, why this stability is not coming. Now, the parochial culture, subject culture and participant culture, they defined also in their own way. For example, a parochial culture they call a culture in which people are ignorant about the political subjects, and they also lack involvement in political activity. So therefore, this parochial culture is basically pre-modern, one can say, or the feature of the traditional society, where people's awareness is less. They are ignorant, they are not well informed, there is shortage of information, and at the same time their involvement with their politics, political system, with their authorities, is also quite lacklustrous, and therefore, in fact, lack of involvement characterizes parochial political culture in the writings of Almond and Barber. Similarly, the subject political culture, in their opinion, stands for citizens' knowledge about political process. Unlike the parochial political culture, in subject political culture, people have enough knowledge about the political process. There is no shortage of information. It is not in short supply. But of course, the people are disinclined to participate in the political process due to sense of powerlessness. This is important. Though they are well informed, they are knowledgeable, there is very good supply of informations, but nonetheless they are disinclined to participate because of their sense of powerlessness, because what happens that they feel that there is no sense, no meaning to participate, because they are not going to affect, or they are not going to make much difference to the entire political activities. Therefore, this is a subject political culture. Now, the third type which they constructed was the participant political culture, which to some extent appears to be the hallmark of modern liberal democracy, where people are both they have a combination of knowledge like the subject political culture, they have a immense knowledge about politics, and also they are equally willing to participate under this impression that they can make difference, they can change the fortunes of the people, they can influence the policies. So therefore, a different type of orientation and attitude people have towards politics. I mean, one can say active citizenry, unlike the subject political culture, which can be called a passive citizenry. So therefore, this participant political culture, in their opinion, is something very significant for democracy, where on the one hand people have knowledge, on the other hand they have also the willingness to participate. Now, of course, this confidence which they find in this participant political culture, the confidence among the people, in the average citizens, that they can influence and they can make a difference, they can change the course of policies through political activity, is perhaps the hallmark of this participant political culture, according to Almond and Weber in this celebrated study. Of course, that does not mean that in their opinion the participant political culture is the best example of a culture suitable for a stable and functioning democracy. Rather, they would go for a mixed system, a system where you have the features of both subject and the participant political culture. Of course, not parochial, because the features of subject and the participant political culture, in their opinion, gives more stability, it gives more, it provides more accommodation, it provides a kind of situation where consensus can be built and a stability could be brought. So therefore, their preference is for the mixed one. One can say that is the ideal type they construct, and this ideal type is basically what they call civic culture. And this model of civic culture, they believe, is best reflected in what we find in United Kingdom, United States of America. Because what are the features of this civic culture, which is the combination of both subject and the participant political culture, according to Almond and Weber? The first feature is the high level of knowledge about political process, that people have high amount of knowledge about political process, particularly it's highly empowering, because they feel that they can, as an activist, as a participant, they can make difference in the fortunes of the people and for their own fortunes. Secondly, they realize that the legitimacy and necessity of political elites. Perhaps this is something suggestive of their ideological orientation of Almond and Weber, because they believe that while the participant political culture in itself is not the best example of a stable liberal democracy, or it in itself cannot be the basis for stability of a liberal democracy, because they feel that along with the participant character of culture, what is also required, that some amount of subjectivity, which is perhaps subjectiveness, that is perhaps the hallmark of subject political culture, that people should have this realization that only political elites can deliver, because political elites can take decisions, the masses cannot. Particularly, it is argued that when the people believe that on their behalf the elites can perhaps take more mature, more profound decisions, rather than people themselves basically entering into the zone of decision making. And therefore, when this balance is achieved, that on the one hand the confidence to make changes in the policy discourse, on the other hand also faith and trust in the political elites, if that type of culture flourishes or develops, perhaps that is the ideal for liberal democracy as per Alman and Weber's formulation. Now, of course, this balance between the subject and the participant political culture, they argue that is achieved through elite sensitivity, particularly if they are more accommodative. If they seek to accommodate the preferences, choices, and also the concerns of the people, such balance is achieved. Then people believe that it is not important that they should themselves rule, rather the elites can rule on their behalf, and it can provide or deliver good to them. So therefore, this depends on the elites, but nonetheless among people presence of this attitude that elites rule perhaps is better than the rule in which the people themselves govern. I think perhaps the hallmark of this civic culture. So therefore, according to Alman and Weber, the civic culture is a combination of both participant and the subject political culture. Here one is reminded of this entire elitist model of democracy, which perhaps is a very important discussion or important intervention in political theory so far as the discussion of democracy is concerned. That how this whole host of political scientists like Dahl and many others have been arguing for quite some time that democracy does not mean the rule of the people. Of course, it is always a rule in which some people, a handful of people rule on behalf of the masses, and therefore it is like a market where consumers and consumers and the producers relationship. So therefore the people are consumer and the leaders are the producers, and this relationship, this balance, what Macpherson once called the equilibrium model of democracy, that how society is made stable, how equilibrium is created. So therefore this elitist model of democracy, which is a very important perspective on question of democracy in political theory, basically one finds a lot of echoes of this elitist model of democracy in this civic culture propounded by Alman and Weber. But at the same time, not only elitist model of democracy, but one is also reminded of the classical thought, and particularly the ideas of Aristotle and Cicero, who also emphasized on accommodation, on restraint and capacity of political process to absorb new demands. And therefore they try to, particularly the way Aristotle constructed the idea of mixed constitution, and how the mixed constitution was the best constitution, and therefore this combination of the extremes, in fact how can be considered the best and the most ideal form of system. Similarly, in Cicero also we have similar ideas and similar inclinations. So therefore what we find that in this civic culture or Alman and Weber, one can say that it is a resurrection of the classical perspective about society, about people's orientation, and about politics, and so on and so forth. Now coming to this question of importance, because of course we will have a more discussion about Alman and Weber later, but one thing is important to remember, that how this entire mood was set in political science, and it is here that I should mention this entire behavioral revolution and the structural functional approach in comparative politics and political science. Of course, as I mentioned, that political culture is defined in terms of attitude, values and beliefs of the people, but at the same time it is also argued that these belief systems, these values, those cultural mores of the people are important in promoting stability and society, and they are perhaps crucial for the survival of any regime. So therefore we find that this way this entire discussion of political culture has moved in political science. But one thing is to be remembered, that why this focus on political culture took place in political science, because entire behavioral revolution was a reaction against traditional approach in comparative politics, particularly the approach which emphasized institutions, which emphasized legal and constitutional studies, mostly not comparative, but singular study of institution and the system and the regime. Of course, they never use the term system. So therefore, what we find that this entire new thrust under the spell of behavioral evolution was meant to offset this imbalance in the study of institutions and study of process. And therefore, after this behavioral evolution started making headway, we find that number of new innovations were made in comparative politics, including this entire discussion of structural functionalism, political system approach, communication approach, and so on and so forth. Number of new tools were devised: political socialization, political communication, etc. and etc. Just in order to find out, a better way and better method to study people's orientation towards politics, in order to understand the behavioral traits of the people, that how people's behavior can be studied, because behavioralism after all stood for such an approach where they moved away from the study of institutions to human behavior, and behavioral traits were perhaps the important focus of study. So therefore, for political culture, this thing came handy, because after all, culture has to be seen in terms of political culture has to be seen in terms of the behavioral traits of the people, group, and the nations. So therefore, this is perhaps in the background that Alman and Bharwaj in 1963 coming with this celebrated work on civic culture, and thereby setting a new benchmark for the study of culture in terms of people's orientation and attitude toward people, towards political system. As I mentioned, that they openly acknowledge Weber and Parsons as two important influences on them. We'll be having some look at this Weber and Parsons traditions and how they have influenced this entire study of political culture in political science. So this is how this all started in 50s and 60s. But that does not mean that it all started in 50s and 60s means that there was no precursor of such theory or precursor of such idea. In fact, as I was mentioning earlier, that one can say the resurrection of many classical ideas through these new approaches in comparative politics and political science. Of course, I mentioned Aristotle and Cicero. For example, the way they talked of a mixed constitution. Aristotle talked of mixed constitution, the combination of extremes, and the way perhaps Alman and Bharwaj talked of civic culture in the same spirit. But what is also important, that culture as a unit of analysis might not have been prominent in their ideas and writings the way perhaps Alman and Bharwaj did through this celebrated work, but nonetheless their entire thrust was to give importance to not only the political dimension of society, but many other dimensions through which human beings live and engage with their political authority and their political arrangement. So therefore, we can say that this is not something new which started with Alman and Bharwaj in 50s and 60s. Now, coming back to its history, particularly one can say the grand theories of culture. This is how scholars have looked at it, because they feel that what Alman and Bharwaj did was basically the building of theories in micro perspective, but there was also a tradition of grand theories in culture. And here they mention Aristotle, Tocqueville, Durkheim, Weber, Marx, Parsons, and so on and so forth. And at least Weber and Parsons directly influenced this entire study of political culture, particularly in Alman and Bharwaj. So therefore, we have to see this grand theory of culture, and then we can only take a proper view of how Alman and Bharwaj looked at culture. Therefore, when we talk of political culture, it becomes important to have a look at the grand theories, particularly on culture, on politics, and so on and so forth. Because it is generally argued that under spell of behavioralism, what political scientists tried to do was to study micro level political reality. Even in terms of the study of culture, their focus was on the behavioral traits of people and attitudes and orientation. Of course, that doesn't mean that they abandoned this entire willingness or abandoned their entire quest for grand theory, but nonetheless they took off from a micro perspective and then moved to the macro one. But at the same time, they were heavily influenced by the great traditions in social theory. Because I will not call political theory, but there were many other influences which came from different areas of social sciences, most notably social anthropology and sociology, and therefore Durkheim, Weber, or for that matter Radcliffe Brown, Talcott Parsons, Malinowski, etc. and etc. were important for both behavioral, structural, functional, and system theory. And Allman and Porwis, Allman and Barwas, their writings are basically also suggestive of that. So therefore, this grand theory becomes important, grand theories of culture, which I mentioned, which includes the ideas and writings and the theories of Aristotle, Tocqueville, Durkheim, Weber, Marx. Of course, the Marx would precede Weber, and then Parsons. So therefore, this is the list. We can say that all of them engage with this issue, people and their codes of behavior, people and their orientation, their belief system, their values, their preferences, the cultural mores, and so on and so forth, the social mores, and so on and so forth. So therefore, how these grand theories engage with this issue becomes important before we move to this question of political culture in comparative politics, as I initiated with reference to Allman and Barwa's writings on civic culture. Now, Aristotle, the classical Greek thinker, who is perhaps very significant for study of many issues in contemporary politics, and that's why there is a renewed interest in Aristotle, particularly through this entire discussion of civic republicanism and so on and so forth. Aristotle believed that it is not only important that we should study institutions, but it is also equally important that we should study social structure, particularly the attendant value system of the people in terms of civility, the consensus generation or formation, the partnership in politics as a middle class values are important for Aristotle. So therefore, Aristotle highlighted the importance of all these things, particularly when he talked about the study of social structure for a better understanding of politics, not simply law, constitution, and institutions, which was normally done in political science. So therefore, it was a leap forward in terms of perspective, particularly in ancient time with Aristotle on this issue. Now, later on also we find that even in modern period, of course, Cicero and others also talked about similar things in their own way. In modern times, the Rousseau, when he gave importance to morality and customs, and said that morality and customs are the basis of political stability. In fact, he was also highlighting the same thing. One can say that when he idealized, or glorified the simple, society, the simple life, when he was building his entire argument for participatory democracy, he was basically looking at a society where the morality and customs play important role. So therefore, one can see that how in Rousseau also you have the similar, suggestion, or one can say the similar argument, of course, in a different way. Similarly, Burke in modern times talked at length about customs and tradition. In fact, Marx also didn't ignore the question of culture. It is a different matter that Marx considered culture as part of superstructural reality of society in terms of his broad classification of base and superstructure. Of course, within Marxism, much later we find that there has been a very significant intervention, a very profound debate on the question of culture, particularly after this onset of structuralism of Althusser and most notably in the writings of Gramsci, particularly in Prison Notebooks, the Italian Marxist philosopher and thinker. We have a very elaborate, intricate discussion of culture. Unlike the classical Marxist formulation, which looked at culture as a superstructural reality, being determined by the economic or material aspect of society without having much autonomy. But later Marxists have given more importance to culture in the working and functioning of society, particularly in terms of the ruling class ideology, that how ruling class rules, and it doesn't rule only through coercion, but it also rules through the formation and generation of consent. And this consent generation is a very intricate process in which civil society plays important role. How civil society institutions like churches, schools, educational institutions, clubs and other things are sites of this consent generation, and through this consent generation ruling class gets the resources to rule. Thereby they basically rule the minds of the people, and the consent is not only through coercion that they rule, but it is after securing the consent of the people through very intricate process of this consent generation in the civil society. So this is what Gramsci talks about through his theory of hegemony, of course in 20th century. Therefore, what we find that within Marxist tradition, of course, earlier the classical Marxism had a very mechanical understanding of culture, particularly the way it looked at base superstructural formulation, base superstructural dimension of society, but subsequently we find that there has been much enrichment of this entire idea, particularly on culture. We will have some discussion of the Marxian perspective on culture in the second part of our discussion. Similarly, you find that Herder believed culture as part of national spirit. Tocqueville, a very important thinker or philosopher or scholar of democracy, he believed that what happens that the democracy does not rest only on constitutional arrangement or on constitutional law. Rather, in fact, it is the mores of society which embrace or which include habit and opinion, in fact, and they are made possible only by religion, that perhaps democracy becomes stable and more functional. So therefore, the role of mores of society, according to Tocqueville, are important. In fact, Tocqueville went to the extent of saying that religion inculcates the moral habits and respect for all human beings, and therefore it provides the cultural moorings of the society and the people. So therefore, how those cultural moorings, how the cultural orientation of the people are influenced by religion, and thereby how democracy is benefited by such thing, in fact, was highlighted by Tocqueville, because in his celebrated work in Democracy in America, in fact, he tried to find out that how American democracy enjoyed superiority over other similar attempts made in other parts of the world. As a French aristocrat, his entire purpose was, this tormented soul. Durkheim was, Tocqueville was, and therefore his purpose was to find out that how American democracy enjoyed superiority over the French and the British type, and where he of course expanded and built on number of developed number of arguments, associational life of the people, how associational aspects of the society, pressure groups and other things have also contributed. But this thing, the importance to the mores of society, is very significant for democracy. So one can say that cultural aspect of democracy he was also perhaps suggesting and hinting at. Now coming to the two important pioneers in terms of the study of modern society, in terms of study of modern institutions, and in terms of the study of culture as a whole. One can say that Durkheim and Weber, they are head and shoulder above other thinkers of their time in terms of their focus, in terms of their approach, and in terms of their contributions. Now, Durkheim and Weber have influenced Parsons, and as I mentioned earlier, Talcott Parsons greatly influenced Almond, Barba, and whole host of structural functionalists and the behavioralists in 20th century. Now, of course, Durkheim and Weber play a crucial role. In fact, Durkheim and Weber play a crucial role in the particularly in terms of the evolution of modern complex industrial society and its understanding, that how a better understanding of modern industrial society can be obtained. Now, of course, since Durkheim and Weber, we find that many scholars in social science have tried to study and explain the role of culture, particularly in terms of its impact on democracy, stability, and functioning of liberal values. Now, of course, in Williams, we find that Raymond Williams, 1958, who is considered a foremost theorist of culture, in fact, he says that it is a complicated and elusive concept, but nonetheless, scholars have been trying to study, analyze, and reflect on this issue, in a big way. In 20th century and even in 21st century. That's why I mentioned that even recently, last 2-3 decades, we find that some new schools have come up, new thinkers, new scholars, new theoreticians, new theories have emerged. And Putnam and the post-materialism, Putnam and his social capital, and similarly the post-materialist school I was mentioning earlier, will have more detailed discussion of the two later. Of course, in fact, in this context, we should remember, as I was mentioning, it is a complicated thing, but nonetheless, as Patrick in 1976, while doing a study, he said there are 30 different meanings of culture in social science. So, therefore, there is no meaning, but nonetheless, there is more or less consensus what culture is all about. And as I mentioned that, attitudes, orientations of the people towards politics. And it is in this context that I was mentioning Durkheim and Weber as the precursor, or one can say the protagonist of this entire discourse on culture. One can say that this grand theory of culture starts with Durkheim and Weber. To mention Durkheim first, because a sociologist who has influenced a whole host of scholars on number of issues related to people, their belief system, the functioning and the working of modern society, and so on and so forth. Durkheim classified societies as traditional and modern, and for him the traditional society stands for he called traditional society with a different name. He called it mechanical solidarity, and the modern society as organic solidarity. But he made a classification between traditional and modern society. He believed that the two have different kinds of social cohesion, and in fact, this cohesion and stability are perhaps the major reference point for for scholars who are using culture to study politics. That how culture brings cohesion in society, and how disruptive forces or disruption or derailment, they are prevented through culture, and how sometimes the disruption is perhaps enhanced and promoted by culture. So therefore, what we find that Durkheim talked of traditional society as a society in which the interaction among people is limited to confines of agrarian community, because traditional society is defined with reference to such economic activity that is related to agriculture. In fact, of course, the nature of the society as such that it is basically family centric, based on families and clans, and therefore what Durkheim argues that one of the hallmark of this traditional society is the commonality and similarity among people. The commonality and similarity among people perhaps are the major reasons for cohesion, because due to similar lifestyle and similar habits among the people, what Durkheim argues that people have a very common set of value preferences, people have common set of behavioral traits and behavioral habits, and therefore what he argues that a different type of solidarity emerges among people, and the solidarity which he calls the mechanical solidarity. And mechanical solidarity is based on the concept of conformity, that all of them conform to a particular set of lifestyles, particular set of values. So therefore, according to Durkheim, this rigid pattern of traditional norms and beliefs within this such society makes them self-contained, particularly the small communities of agrarian society, as I was mentioning, that hallmark of traditional society becomes self-contained, and therefore the nature of the division of labor in such society according to Durkheim is also highly limited, and division of labor essentially happens according to the capability of a small number of people in every group. So therefore the nature of division of labor in this traditional society according to Durkheim is also quite narrow, and therefore the base of division of labor is quite narrow, and therefore the society which emerges due to all such characteristics in fact according to him is a segmented society. In fact such segmented society is perhaps one which is based on mechanical solidarity, but solidarity among the people in terms of the conformity to certain belief system. Those belief systems are essentially traditional customs, religion, and so on and so forth. So therefore, in fact this is how Durkheim tried to construct this entire traditional modern dichotomy in terms of the societal classification. In fact in modern society according to Durkheim of course is different from this traditional society which is based on mechanical solidarity. In fact the modern society is characterized by high density of population, competition among people, increased social division of labor instead of those narrow and very segmented division of labor. You have more elaborate and more differentiated division of labor, and therefore this division of labor in modern society according to Durkheim creates certain conditions in which a new type of interdependence and cohesion also emerge. So therefore if the cohesion in the traditional society emerges out of the mechanical solidarity, the cohesion in the modern society according to Durkheim is a fallout of such interdependence among the people, because this elaborate nature of division of labor makes people dependent on each other for their survival, for their needs, and therefore what happens that is interdependence makes the society cohesive, unlike the traditional society which is cohesive on account of conformity to religion, customs, tradition, and so on and so forth. The second aspect of this modern society is the social differentiation of roles among the people. Earlier in a traditional society the roles are fused, but in modern society roles are differentiated. The allocation of roles acquire altogether different form and different format, and accordingly he also argues that a specialization of institutions also emerges along with the specialization of roles. So what we find that in Durkheim we have a very elaborate discussion of modern and traditional society, and modern society seen as a complex but integrated through organic solidarity, which perhaps is something suggestive of that how culture plays important role in giving a stability and cohesion to all societies, whether traditional or modern. But of course the functioning and the working of culture in modern society is different from what we see in traditional society. So therefore what happens that it creates a new pattern of morality, new flexibility in rules, particularly in context of this transition from traditional to modern. Social rules emerge to guide complex and diverse activities, and therefore individual enjoys more freedom in modern society compared to what they perhaps have in the traditional settings. But what happens, is there any question?
Yes, there is a question waiting for us, and the viewer is from Varanasi, so maybe have the question right now.
Good afternoon, sir.
Hello.
Good afternoon, ma'am.
Hello, listener, can you please repeat the question?
Yes, ma'am. My question is, what is the perspective of political culture of India? And my second question is, what is the view
please repeat the question, I can't hear you.
and Vidhan Sabha election together, and what is the hurdle behind this? Hello. Hello.
There is no volume, but I can hear that there is a question. Please stay on the line and repeat the question.
In the meanwhile,
yes,
we should
ma'am.
carry forward
My first
our
question is, what
discussion.
is
Yes,
the
we should carry with the
perspective of
discussion and we can take up the
political
question
culture of India
little later.
And my
So
second
therefore,
question
in
is,
fact, what I was
is the view of
mentioning here
conducting the
that for Durkheim, yeah, yes, go ahead. I can hear you. No, I mean, there is some disruption in line.
There is some disruption.
Yeah. So I mean,
Hello.
yeah.
Hello.
Yes, ma'am.
Yes, please ask the question.
Yes, ma'am. Hello, ma'am.
Yeah, yeah. You
Yes.
mentioned your question.
Madam, my question is, what is the perspective of Indian culture of India? And my second question is, what is the view behind conducting the Vidhan Sabha and Lok Sabha election together, and what is the hurdle behind this?
I could get the second question where you are asking what is the reason of conducting the Lok Sabha and Vidhan Sabha elections together and what are the hurdles?
There are two different questions here. In fact, the second is not directly related to what we are discussing, that conducting parliamentary election and assembly elections together. The first one perhaps is more relevant for our discussion, that what is I mean the contribution of Indian culture, or how one looks at Indian culture. In fact, we will be having some discussion on this issue in the the later part of our discussion, if perhaps not today, but in the second part, particularly on Asian debate on the Asian values and that how they have contributed to economic development and democracy. There is a whole host of writings and arguments on this issue, not only about India but about China, about many other Asian countries. In fact, after this Chinese economic development, Chinese witnessed a massive economic growth, along with what we called Asian miracles, particularly many Southeast Asian countries attaining a new height in terms of economic growth and prosperity. This debate has started, that how culture has contributed to it, because earlier the perception was that Asian cultures are static, they are not congenial and conducive for economic growth. This is how perhaps Weber also studied Protestant ethics and a spirit of capitalism, because his entire take on capitalism was that capitalism didn't simply emerge from the combination of land, labor and capital, but it was the Calvinism, that is the Protestantism within Christianity, which basically became the catalyst for capitalist growth in the Western Europe. The kind of attitude among the people it developed and generated. From otherworldly they became this worldly. The way they perhaps gave importance to work ethics, when they called time as money, when they called work as worship. So these were the new ethics of the society. New attitudes were generated, and how religion contributed towards it perhaps was the subject of study of Weber in his that celebrated work Protestant Ethics and a Spirit of Capitalism. But we should remember that Weber also did a comparative study of religions and studied many non-Western religions, particularly Asian religion, Buddhism, Confucianism, Jainism and so on and so forth. And therefore, he made a distinction between otherworldly religions and this worldly religion, and he believed that Asian religions are mostly otherworldly, therefore they are not conducive for capitalism. But what has happened in recent times, that again a renewed interest has been shown on studying Asian value system. On the one hand, one school of thought says that Asian value system is basically the same as perhaps Weber and other thinkers had suggested earlier, but the other school is saying that no, the Confucianism as a value system is contributing handsomely in the promotion of economic prosperity of China. So therefore, this culture aspect of Asia is being studied. From the India's point of view, of course, there are a lot of interesting work on political culture. The most important contribution was made by political scientist Rajni Kothari in his celebrated book Politics in India, that how the political culture which developed in India was different from other third world countries, particularly in light of the entire freedom movement, national movement, non-violent freedom movement which developed here. And that's why India is perhaps an exception in terms of the stability and the survival of democracy among the many newly independent nations of Asia, Africa and Latin America. So therefore, this aspect has to be seen, that Indian culture, how it has contributed to development of a particular set of attitudes and approach and value system in politics, and how it has contributed for stability, survival and perhaps of the working of successful democracy in India. So, in fact, this is something important. We will be looking at all these issues in our discussion, which will be spread in two different parts. The first part is being delivered today, and second part will come later. What I was trying to say earlier about Durkheim, so therefore, he believes that modern society, of course, has a different cultural moorings from the traditional society, and therefore, individual enjoys more freedom. But at the same time, he also perhaps hinted a potential danger that individuals' desires and ambitions sometimes go beyond the general moral codes created by the society, and therefore, what happens when those ambitions outstrip those social mores and the social codes, what happens that a different type of disenchantment and dissatisfaction set in, leading to what he called anomie. And therefore, it should be remembered that Durkheim is one person thinker who also authored a book on suicide, that how the rate of suicide increases in certain situations, until what point the rate of suicide is normal and when it becomes abnormal. So, therefore, anomie, suicide, all these things were perhaps being studied by Durkheim from the point of view of such situations emerging in modern context. But what is important from the point of view of political culture, as I was mentioning, that Durkheim and Weber are the important precursor for the study of political culture in political science, is in terms of the importance they gave to these social mores, political attitude, the attitudes of the people and formation of value system. Along with Durkheim, there is another classical thinker, Max Weber. In fact, his entire concern was rise of capitalism in Eastern Europe, as I was mentioning just now. In fact, he tried to find out the distinctive evolution of the cultural process that enabled the formation of a rational state, because rationalism, modern rationality in terms of the combination of ends and means, that how people create appropriate means to attain appropriate ends. So, this is perhaps how modern rationality is understood, and this is how perhaps Weber defined rationality, the modern rationality. Of course, for Weber, these modern business organizations, the rationality is best reflected in modern business organizations which flourish through the efficient use of capital and cost reduction, and at the same time proper climate for investment. So, therefore, this is a rational calculation which makes the modern society different from the traditional society. So, this psychological transformation, how the competitive spirit of capitalism emerged through Calvinism, as I was mentioning, was perhaps the reference point of Weber, because he believed that from the leisurely pre-capitalist culture, people moved to a more contemporary, hard-working, modern capitalist culture, and this is perhaps was important for rise of capitalism. Therefore, what we find that Protestant ethics and a spirit of capitalism is an important contribution on a study of political culture and attitudes of the people. So, therefore, this is not just a chance that Durkheim and Weber are important influences on Alman and Barba and many others who have studied political culture. In our next part, we will be taking up specifically the discussion of Alman and Barba, his study of 5 nations, and the criticisms which have been leveled against them, particularly by Putnam, the post-materialist school, and then Leffert and his entire consociational theory on issue of political culture.
Thank you very much, sir, for a very enlightening talk. Dear students, you can send in your queries. I'm sure you'll have many questions to ask Dr. Sanjay Kumar Jha. So please send in your queries at the email address given in the bottom of the screen. Thank you, sir. Thank you, dear students, for watching this lecture.